Hello, and welcome everybody. I think we're ready to get started. Thank you so much for joining us. We have a really wonderful webinar for you today. Today we're going to be talking about the Biden administration's upcoming nuclear posture review. And we have two fantastic speakers, three actually. If you are just joining us and haven't joined us from one of our webinars before, this is hosted by the Physicists Coalition for Nuclear Threat Reduction. And if you are interested in learning more about our organization and our group and our activities, our organizer, Charlotte Selton, who's here as well, will leave a link in the chat that will provide you with more background on our organization. So I welcome you to looking into that. Today, we're going to be talking about the nuclear posture review. It's happening now. It's an important topic. Really, the Biden administration is looking about whether it's going to be continue the nuclear status quo or make a new path for the United States on nuclear policy and posture. And we have two really knowledgeable guests who will be laying out not just what the nuclear posture review is, what the important issues that are likely to be addressed and maybe give us some predictions, as well as some ideas about how we can affect this process in order to see the kinds of changes we seek. Our first, so some housekeeping, we'll have remarks by both Tom Kalina and Jessica Sleight, one after the other. And then we'll have a question and answer period. And I encourage you to submit your questions with the Q&A function, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen, rather than the chat. If you put it in the Q&A, we can keep better track of those. So we'll have both speakers and then we'll open it up for your discussions. And then at the end, our colleague Charlotte Selton will describe our advocacy actions that we're taking currently around the policy of no first use, and we'll talk about how you can get involved. So thanks so much for coming. We're going to first introduce both of our speakers and then have Tom and Jessica speak. So first we have, so pleased to have Tom Collina. He's the Director of Policy at the Ploughshares Fund. With 30 years of Washington, D.C. experience in nuclear weapons policy, missile defense, and non-proliferation issues, he's a co-author with the former Secretary of Defense, William Perry, of a new book, fantastic work, called The Button, The New Nuclear Arms Race and Presidential Power from Truman to Trump. It was published last year. Tom also co-hosts the Ploughshares Fund podcast called Press the Button, and Jessica was a recent guest. It was fantastic. It's really a must listen. I encourage you to listen every week. He's testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee and Foreign Relations Committees and is published in the New York Times and the Washington Post, among others. And Tom's degrees in international relations from Cornell University. And his interlocutor today is Jessica Sleight, who currently serves as the program director for Global Zero organization. And she provides research and analysis on issues related to nuclear non-proliferation, risk reduction, and disarmament. She helps to coordinate Track 1.5 and Track 2 diplomatic efforts and liaise with the Global Zero leaders and experts in connection with policy initiatives. She also co-authored a fantastic report I also commend to you, and maybe we could put a link in the chat to that too, a report called The End of Nuclear Warfighting, which is an alternative US nuclear posture review that was in 2018, which outlines a different way of going forward. She's also a member of the 2020 Center for Strategic and International Studies project on nuclear issues as a mid-career cadre. And I am really looking forward to hearing them both talk about the nuclear posture review and the issues that we should be looking at. So first, I'll hand it over to Tom Collina.
Laura, thank you very much. And thanks to the coalition for having me speak today. I'm really looking forward to it. It's a great opportunity. I'm going to talk briefly about the nuclear posture review, what it is, what Biden is trying to do or should be trying to do, and then talk about a few of the key issues that are going to be primarily brought up in the posture review. So a nuclear posture review, what is it? It basically sets nuclear policy for a new president coming into office. Every president since Clinton has done one of these. And so now Biden is doing his. No great surprises here. The way the process works, it's an interagency drafting process led by the Pentagon, but including all the agencies you could imagine that would want to be part of such a thing. They are drafting now. They're supposed to conclude the process by the end of January, but whether they actually do that is yet to be determined. The interagency drafting group is supposed to send options to the president. And that's the important thing here, is that this is the president's policy. Nuclear weapons are the president's weapons. And so the president's views are paramount on nuclear policy. So the NPR interagency group is to send options to the president, and the president is to choose among those options what he, in this case, wants his nuclear policy to be. And that's the important thing, is that whatever options get sent, it's still up to the president to decide what he wants to do. And this interagency group is doing listening sessions now. I've been part of one of those. Others, I'm sure, on this call will or have been as well. So they're kind of taking in a lot of information. It's not clear yet whether they've actually put pen to paper, but presumably that should be happening now. I just wanted to raise one controversy that's come up so far, and this has come up around a staffing issue. The former person that was sort of holding the pen, or going to be the lead drafter for the NPR, Leonor Tamero, she was serving as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear and Missile Defense Policy, quite a mouthful. She was providing the day-to-day management and leadership of the NPR. She was removed due to pressures, I believe, from Republicans in the Senate that her views were too forward-leaning, too progressive. The official reason for her departure was, quote unquote, reorganization. You can take that for what it is. But to me, this sends a chilling message to anyone in the Pentagon who's trying to change things, that if you try too much or try too hard, you will get bounced out. And so I think this is lesson number one for us that we should have known a long time ago. The Pentagon should not run NPRs, right? If you want to make change, don't ask the Pentagon to do it, because the Pentagon has no interest in changing nuclear policy. If President Biden wants to change nuclear policy, he should run the NPR from the White House, not from the Pentagon. And the lesson for us here is that if we want to change policy, we need to get to President Biden. And so we can discuss that later in the session. So shifting from the broader concept of the NPR to no first use and sole purpose, which is the issue I'd like to talk about. And it's the issue that's most been in the media and the press that's the greatest controversy, in part because it's one of the few things that might get changed, and not clear that it will be, but at least it appears to be on the table. So, and no first use and sole purpose are very much misunderstood as about how similar or different are they, and I'll get into that in a minute. So it's a good thing to discuss. But just stepping back, no first use has been a goal for many years as a key way to reduce the risk of nuclear war. And to me, the greatest risk would be to stumble by mistake into nuclear war due to an uninformed or unstable president making a rash decision based on bad information or a false alarm. And no first use would reduce the risk by creating more decision time for presidents. And I think that's a key aspect across all these things. We want to create as much decision time as possible for a president to decide whether or not launching nuclear weapons would be a good idea. Now, sole purpose is closely related to no first use, but not the same, or not necessarily the same, which we'll get to. But just in terms of a little history of where this process has come through the NPR process, Obama's nuclear posture review in 2010 began to move in this direction. It was reported that he wanted to go for no first use and sole purpose, but was kind of talked out of it at the last minute. And so what the Obama NPR went for is that the fundamental role, not the sole purpose, but the fundamental role of US nuclear weapons is to deter nuclear attack on the United States. So he stopped short of declaring sole purpose or no first use, but pledged in that review that he would work to establish the conditions under which sole purpose could eventually be adopted. So the Biden NPR set an expectation that sole purpose would come later. And so that's what we're hoping for from the Biden administration. Now, of course, since then, in between, we got the Trump administration, and the Trump NPR from 2018 close the door on that completely. And instead, they, in that review, expand the role of nuclear weapons, for example, to respond to cyber attacks or other major non-nuclear attacks, and clearly rejected the idea of sole purpose, saying deterring a nuclear attack is not the sole purpose of nuclear weapons. So that's what the Trump administration had to say about this. Going back to the end of the Obama administration, Obama, after the NPR, made another run at no first use, again, sort of pulled back at the last minute. But Biden, at that time as vice president, gave a speech at the end of the administration where he publicly called for sole purpose, and again, setting again a clear expectation that if he were president, sole purpose is something he would support. And indeed, as a candidate for president, he once again called for sole purpose. So let's dig a little bit. So clearly, sole purpose is an expectation that we might see in the nuclear posture review under the Biden administration. But for a minute, let me talk about the difference between no first use and sole purpose. And I'm going to try to share my screen, hoping to the technology gods that this will work. Is that working? Excellent, excellent. So this is probably an oversimplified depiction of the situation, and my apologies if I left out too many details. But I just wanted to basically show the lay of the land for no first use, sole purpose, and then compare that to current policy. So you can see that the easiest one to understand here is no first use, which is why I think it's a great policy, because it's so simple. No first use means that the only role for nuclear weapons is to retaliate to a nuclear attack, right? You're never using them first, and you're certainly never using them to deter a non-nuclear attack, say a chem, bio, conventional, or cyber attack, and they have no role whatsoever in response to states that don't have nuclear weapons, non-nuclear weapon states. So no first use, the only role is to use nuclear weapons in retaliation to a nuclear attack. Now, sole purpose, if you just read the words of sole purpose, it's essentially the same as no first use. The sole purpose of nuclear weapons is to deter their use by others and retaliate if necessary. So if you look at, if the sort of the narrow or strict reading of that would say first use is not allowed because nuclear weapons are only to deter nuclear weapons use by others. And it's very similar to no first use in that no use against chem, bio, conventional, or cyber threats. And again, no use of nuclear weapons against non-nuclear states. The problem here is that many people interpret sole purpose in a more liberal or flexible way, if you will, that it would actually allow first use in certain situations, primarily to preempt a nuclear attack by another country or other undefined areas. So whether or not sole purpose allows first use, to me, under the Biden administration is a question mark that we have not seen the administration answer yet. But clearly the Biden administration makes a distinction between no first use, which they're shying away from, and sole purpose, which they're more supportive of. Therefore, they must see a difference, a distinction between sole purpose and no first use. And I think that distinction is that they would see the possibility of the first use of nuclear weapons against a impending nuclear attack, so preemption or some other scenario like that. But sole purpose, although not as good as, from my perspective, as no first use, is better than the current policy that we are left with from the Trump administration, where the current policy basically allows the first use of nuclear weapons in pretty much any situation except a non-nuclear weapon state. It would allow first use against nuclear weapons, and it would allow the deterrence using nuclear weapons against non-nuclear attacks, chem, bio, conventional, cyber. And again, from my perspective, anytime you add another mission for nuclear weapons, you're making it more likely that those weapons will be used, which increases the risk of nuclear war, not decreasing it. So just a couple of thoughts about this. I mean, to me, no first use is the clear winner. As I said, reducing the risk of nuclear war, especially accidental war, slows down decision-making. Sole purpose is the next best. It's better than the current policy, as it would rule out the use of nuclear weapons against non-nuclear threats. But it's harder to explain. It's harder to define sole purpose I'm talking about. And it doesn't eliminate the quick use options, right? Because if you interpret sole purpose as allowing preemption, therefore first use, you still need to have weapons on alert. And to me, a lot of that is where the danger of accidental nuclear war comes from, is our high alert policies, the fact that we're ready to launch weapons at any moment, that an unstable president can launch nuclear weapons at any moment, and then other countries perceive that we're ready to launch nuclear weapons at any moment, and therefore they're ready to launch their weapons at any moment as well. So, but the bottom line is that the current policy is what is the most dangerous, in that we have all these different ways we can use nuclear weapons against these many, many different scenarios, including all of these non-nuclear threats, which just raises the risk of nuclear war starting in a situation where they really have no role. So to me, what do we want from the NPR? I think, if we think of it this way, you want a policy in place that if you get another President Trump or another similar type of person coming into office, what are the guardrails that you want around that person so they don't launch nuclear war at all, and certainly not one that is by mistake or by accident. We want to slow down the decision process. We want to reduce nuclear risk. So one of those things we should do is to declare no first use or sole purpose. And even if that sole purpose policy is not as narrowly defined as we might like, we also want to end the sole authority for the president to be able to make these decisions on their own unilateral authority. We want to end launch on warning, which makes it possible to launch US nuclear weapons in response to a false alarm. Therefore, us starting a nuclear war, which to me is the ultimate nightmare. And we want to take ICBMs off alert and ultimately eliminate them. So we want to do all these things, but a great first step would be sole purpose, even if loosely defined. Much better than the current policy, not as good as no first use, but I think it will be a significant step towards that goal. And why don't I stop there and turn it back to Laura? And I'll stop sharing my screen.
Tom, thank you so much for this excellent overview of how the process works and some of the priority issues that the administration is looking for, and really what you hope to see. And I hope we can dig into more of those issues of substance in our question and answer, but thank you for laying the land so well. Next, we have Jessica Sleight, who's going to talk about, in addition, some of the other issues that the administration will be looking at. Thanks. Go ahead, Jessica.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This is a really great program, and I am very excited for how many people are here. I am so thankful for your interest and for your engagement on these issues. We really need everyone to make progress on this. So I'm going to share my screen. Tom did a great job of laying out where we are with the NPR and in some of the issues that we're looking at. I'm going to dig in a little bit more to the NPR and actually also mention a couple of things that Congress is looking at as well. Because as I think some of you probably know, they hold the purse strings. So Congress does have a role to play in some of nuclear weapons issues, but we'll focus mostly on the NPR. So the first one I would like to go over here, the first topic is the ground-based strategic deterrent. This is part of the $1.7 trillion and growing modernization plan that the US has implemented since the Obama administration. The ground-based strategic deterrent, or the GBSD, would be a replacement for our Minuteman III intercontinental ballistic missiles that sit in silos in the middle of the country, basically. And the projected lifetime cost of these missiles is at $264 billion. That number is likely to grow, as most things do when it comes to money and when it comes to time with nuclear weapons. And so what the NPR is going to be looking at is what are options for the future of our ICBM leg of the triad. The options that are out there right now are GBSD replacement, so a like-for-like replacement of our ICBMs, or you could do a GBSD replacement at lower numbers. Right now, we're at 400 that are deployed. So taking a look at, can we lower that number to 300, 200, 100? Another option is to cancel the GBSD program completely and extend the life of the Minuteman III missile, also looking at lowering those numbers as well. And the recommendation that we have and what we call for is actually to cancel the ground-based strategic deterrent and phase out our ICBM leg of the triad. And Tom went over a few reasons for this. Number one is that these are dangerous missiles. They are redundant missiles. They are not meant for 21st century security. They might have had a role to play in the Cold War, but they are no longer necessary. We can have a credible deterrent with submarines and reserve bombers. And so in order to reduce the risk of nuclear war by accident, by miscalculation, by launch on false warning, eliminating those ICBMs is going to bring more benefit to us. So the Biden administration, their 2022 budget request that they put out earlier this year continued funding for the GBSD. And we just saw a report recently, I think it was this week actually, that the Department of Defense asked the Carnegie Endowment experts to do a study on ICBM alternatives. So they are looking at this issue, I think, perhaps more than previous presidents have. They definitely didn't in the Trump administration. I don't really know that they did in the Obama administration. I think they were all pretty committed to the triad. But I think it's a helpful nod from the Biden administration that they are looking at their options for ICBM alternatives. I will say that the Carnegie Endowment noted that they are looking at alternatives with the assumption that the leg will be maintained, but we'll see what comes out of that, I guess. And then I did want to mention that there is some movement in Congress on this. So there's two bills, actually. They are both called the ICBM Act, but different acronyms. But they're from Senator Markey and Representative Kalina, introduced an act to extend the Minuteman III missile and redirect savings to the coronavirus vaccine or other purposes. And then Representative Garamendi introduced another bill, and actually an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act, to prohibit funding for the GBSD program and its associated warhead and extend the Minuteman III missiles until 2040. Right now, the House and the Senate defense spending bills both actually prohibit a reduction in the current number of deployed ICBMs and any kind of change in their alert levels. Those defense spending bills haven't gone through quite yet. I think the Senate is still looking at their defense bill. So we'll have to see what happens there. But in terms of the NPR, I do think that we will be maintaining this leg of the triad, but it will be interesting to see if there's a change in numbers here. The next topic I wanted to touch on is the sea-launched cruise missile, and also known as SLCM. So SLCM is a low-yield, quotes, low-yield nuclear missile that George H.W. Bush back in 1991 ordered the removal of from our submarines. And the last SLCM was removed, officially retired in 2013 under Obama. So presidents from H.W. Bush to Obama agreed that we didn't need them anymore. They were redundant, let's retire them. Enter Trump, and the Trump NPR decided that we actually need to develop a nuclear armed sea-launched cruise missile. The reason given for this was to fill a perceived gap in our low yield response options. I will say that gap is non-existent. They basically created a dangerous solution for a problem that does not exist. Even our then acting Navy Secretary back in June of 2021 put out a memo directing the Navy to plan to cut funds for the SLCM. This is a weapon that even the Navy says they don't need and they don't necessarily even really want. And part of the reason for that is that a nuclear armed cruise missile actually kind of interrupts the Navy's conventional mission requirements. So there is a discernment problem. So if you have conventional missiles on a ship and they are both nuclear conventional missiles, or excuse me, nuclear cruise missiles and conventionally armed cruise missiles, if you decide to use a conventional armed cruise missile, the person that you are using against or the country that you are using it against is not going to know if it's actually a conventionally armed cruise missile or a nuclear armed cruise missile. And so there's a danger in that, in crossing the nuclear threshold and stumbling into nuclear war. So the options for the Biden administration is either to move forward with this plan or to cancel. And of course, our recommendation is that you cancel this plan because it's dangerous and it's redundant. We have other low yield options. We do not need another one. The Biden administration, or excuse me, President Biden, when he was campaigning, basically said that he did not think that the US needed any new nuclear weapons. So that would include the sea-launched cruise missile. Unfortunately, in his 2022 budget request earlier this year, he continued funding for the sea-launched cruise missile that was funded back in the Trump administration. The reason given for this is the Biden administration basically said, well, we want to do a nuclear posture review. We want to look at everything, complete that nuclear posture review, and then we will make the necessary budget requests and budget changes. This, I think, came as maybe a little bit more of a surprise from the nuclear arms control community. We thought maybe that this was something that was pretty cut and dry, that you did not need this cruise missile, and we shouldn't even be spending millions on a development stage or a design stage for something that we very much do not need. On the congressional side, there is a Nuclear Slickum Ban Act introduced by Senator Van Hollen that prohibits funding for any work on a nuclear armed Slickum and its associated nuclear warhead. So where the Biden administration comes out on this is one of very much hope that they see and recognize that we do not need it, but it is something to watch. Oops, there we go. And moving on to the B-83 gravity bomb. The B-83 gravity bomb, the Obama administration made a decision to retire this bomb after the B-6112, which is another gravity bomb, enters into service in early 2020s. The reason the Obama administration said we can retire the B-83 is because it's redundant when we have the B-61 that can carry out the same mission. And the B-83 is a very high yield weapon, which makes it strategically unappealing. It's 1.2 megatons. That is about 80 times the yield of a Hiroshima bomb. And so having that in your arsenal, making a decision to use it is going to be very unappealing, very unpopular. There's no strategic use for that kind of huge weapon. The Trump administration saw it differently. In their NPR, they stated that the B-83 would be indefinitely sustained until a, quote, suitable replacement is identified. They did not say anything about the B-6112 being a suitable replacement for that bomb. So right now, the B-83 is kind of in limbo. Of course, our recommendation is to retire the B-83. We do not need that humongous nuclear weapon. The Biden administration, again, their 2022 budget request actually increased funding for the B-83 to start working on replacing some of the components of it to make sure it was reliable. Again, the justification for that was we have to do our nuclear posture review, and then some changes or some decisions on these weapons will come. Congress is very skeptical of the B-83. The House cut funding to begin any kind of life extension on the B-83, and the Senate also conditioned any funding on certification that you actually need to life extend the B-83. So Congress is very skeptical of this, and I'm hoping that that indicates that this is very politically unpalatable and that Biden will make the decision again to retire this weapon as the B-61 enters service. There's also an issue about plutonium pit production. So the 2018 NPR, Nuclear Posture Review, and Congress requires the NNSA at the Department of Energy that cares for our nuclear warheads to be able to make 80 plutonium pits per year by 2030. Right now, our facilities are not able to produce that many plutonium pits. So the NNSA would need to upgrade their Los Alamos facility to be able to do that. They would also need to build a new facility at the Savannah River site in order to do this. It is our recommendation that they do not build that new facility at the Savannah River site. There are environmental considerations. We do not need to be making 80 pits per year. There is the justification for making 80 pits per year is based on some questionable, I would say, studies about how long plutonium pits last. And so basically, we do not need to be making 80 pits per year. We do not need to be spending money on a new facility in order to make 80 pits per year. But this is something that we'll be looking out for in the Biden NPR as well. A couple other issues to watch, and Tom actually hit on some of these as well. Sole authority. So the power vested in every president to order a nuclear launch and the inability for anybody to stop that launch. The Trump presidency in all of its glory, I guess, really put a spotlight on this undemocratic power of the presidency. But this is an important issue no matter who is president. Senator Ed Markey and Representative Ted Lieu introduced the Restricting First Use of Nuclear Weapons Act. It prohibits a first use nuclear strike unless Congress expressly authorizes such a strike and declares war. In terms of the NPR, and Tom, I would actually love to hear your thoughts on this. I actually do not believe that sole authority will be addressed in the NPR. It is very difficult for any president to put constraints on presidential authority. They don't want to set a precedent for other presidents. They don't want to constrain their own authority. So in that case, I don't necessarily think anything really is going to change when it comes to presidential authority, at least from the nuclear posture review, Biden's nuclear posture review. Another issue to watch is the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, also known as the Ban Treaty, which entered into force recently. Traditionally, the United States has kind of had some hostile rhetoric around the treaty. They encouraged states not to interact with it. They actually sent letters to those who ratified it to say, actually withdraw from it, don't ratify it anymore. We don't want it to go into force. And of course it has. And so what's going to be interesting is, will Biden kind of continue this kind of adversarial rhetoric against the treaty, or will it recognize its entry into force, recognize that it is a culmination of frustration from non-nuclear weapon states over the lack of progress toward elimination, and realize that it is not a threat to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And the last thing I actually wanted to do was to bring it back around to declaratory policy and just offer my own 2 cents. I agree with everything basically that Tom said. No first use is where we need to go. No first use is a place where we can go. And both no first use and sole purpose follow the Biden-Putin joint reaffirmation back over the summer that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. And I think that's really important because, especially during the Trump administration, but even a little bit before, nuclear war planners, nuclear policymakers, there has been a kind of a resurgence of going back to planning to win, planning to fight a nuclear war. And if we are going off the assumption that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought, we need to back that up in our policies and in our strategies. And so no first use, as much as a declaration has a lot of value in bringing back the rhetoric around nuclear weapons and reducing the role of nuclear weapons in national security, it's also really important to see no first use as part of an overall strategy that moves us away from nuclear war fighting and moves us toward a retaliatory only posture and something that's going to increase US and allied security. So a no first use commitment, and Tom kind of alluded to this in his remarks as well, necessitates changes to nuclear practices, to our force structure, and to posture in order to make it credible. That includes ending the practice of launch on warning, de-alerting nuclear weapons, phasing out our ICBMs, revisiting our mission requirements and our target requirements, and strengthening our nuclear command and control systems. So we're really looking at a rethinking of our nuclear strategy for the 21st century. And I also do want to point out, it is really important when we're talking about no first use, when we're talking about sole purpose, that we do acknowledge that we need to work with our allies on steps to reassure them of our US commitments to allied security. I know in the media a lot of times, and conservatives a lot of times will say, we can't even talk about no first use because our allies don't like it. And while it's true that our allies have concerns, saying we can't talk about no first use is unproductive. If we can't talk about no first use, how are we ever going to address the rising risk of nuclear use? Especially with the emergence of this new nuclear arms race with Russia, with China, and with stuff that the US is doing as well, we need to keep the conversation open, no matter kind of what the NPR, how it comes out. Of course, we hope it has no first use. It probably won't have no first use. We hope it has sole purpose. It could have sole purpose. But no matter the outcome, we want to make sure that we are keeping the conversation going. We are bringing more voices into that conversation. We are opening up the people who are setting our nuclear policy, and we're demanding progress to reduce the risk of nuclear use. And so with that, I will stop sharing and turn it back over to Laura.
Jessica, thank you so much for digging into these issues a little deeper. And I'm looking forward to bringing some of the attendees' questions to you. A couple of reminders. We really encourage you to ask questions, but if you could please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, we can better keep track of them so we don't miss them. You are welcome to use the chat and talk amongst yourselves, but we will not be pulling questions from there. I'd also point you to some of the previous webinars by the coalition, and I think Charlotte can drop the link into the chat to those, where we went into some depth to some of the issues that Tom and Jessica were able to bring to light. So there are other resources that we have here, but I'm gonna go back first and I had this question as well. One of the questions that came up early in your talk, Tom, was asking for a deeper discussion about what the arguments were when the Obama administration took a relook at the sole purpose, first use policy later in the administration, and why that ended up not happening. And I would ask you if the context has changed, anything important has changed since then, and what your appraisal of that is.
Thanks, Laura. Great question. I think there was two phases in the Obama administration. One was the very early phase when they were doing their nuclear posture review. and they were considering no first use and sole purpose. And at that time, people raised these scenarios. For example, what if a country has a cache of biological weapons? And we are concerned that that will be used against the United States. And the only way to ensure we could destroy it all was with a nuclear weapon. There were a number of these scenarios, which to me are highly unlikely, or situations that I would think you could handle with conventional weapons, that were questions enough for President Obama that he didn't go forward with no first use or sole purpose at that time, but therefore put this language into the Obama NPR that we will work towards sole purpose. And then in the second Obama term, Obama made another run at no first use, and this unfortunately came too late. It was in the last year of his second term, where he put together an interagency process, excuse me, wanted to move forward with no first use. It's my understanding that Vice President Biden at the time was on board with that, but that they simply didn't have the time to do the kind of briefings to the allies, as Jessica discussed, would be necessary. And as we know, no first use makes the allies, particularly European allies, Japan, South Korea, very nervous. And other members of the Obama cabinet felt that given the concern of the allies and the direct interventions of some of these key allies saying they didn't like this or were made very uncomfortable by it, that they didn't have enough time to do the diplomacy and the reassuring that would have been necessary. And this is often misunderstood. Obama at the end of his term did not reject no first use. I think he still supported it, but simply reasoned that there wasn't enough time to get it done. They let it slide into what they thought would be a Hillary Clinton administration. And we all know how that turned out. So I do believe the lesson is from Obama and Biden that in the Obama administration, they supported no first use and sole purpose, but couldn't quite muster the political capital to get it done. And I would say this is true of no first use across the atomic age. And I would call it, the no first use paradox, which is that no president could imagine using nuclear weapons first, right? I mean, since, we haven't used nuclear weapons in 76 years, even in situations where the United States has faced military defeat or stalemate. The United States has never used nuclear weapons since 1945. Presidents basically across the board sane presidents anyway, cannot imagine doing it. And yet they are not willing to spend the political capital to make it policy that the United States will never use nuclear weapons first. That's the paradox we face. I think it's explained by the fact that it's just too painful for a president to do that in terms of the political capital they need to spend to get it done. They believe in it, they want to do it, but ultimately they're talked out of it by the resistance that they will face.
Right, thank you. It's helpful to know how difficult it is to make changes to the status quo. So this is for you, Jessica, and this is someone asked, how can we make progress in nuclear policy if new administrations can make changes every 4 to 8 years? And you touched on this at the end of your comments about how a no first use or sole purpose policy as a declaratory policy is just one step of making changes to the way we think about nuclear weapons. And I wonder if that's part of the way you would answer a question like this. How do we make durable, resilient changes to nuclear weapons policies?
Yeah, I think that's kind of spot on. Is when you're talking about a declaratory policy, yes, when it's just rhetoric, that is pretty easy to reverse. Although I do have a sense of, if we have a no first use policy and the next president says, no, I need to be able to use nuclear weapons first, I think there's a little bit of political weirdness there to say, for a president to have to say that. But you're right, we don't want to have any kind of whiplash back and forth. And so the way to make sure that these policies are consistent and we're building on them is to then say that this is part of a strategy And here are the force structure and force posture implications that are stemming from this strategy. And we are going to be implementing these. And here is the timeline. Congress funded, making sure that the trains start going down the track. And making sure that folks understand the why of it, and building that support in Congress, having the support of the public. All of this kind of adds up to making sure that we have kind of a consistent, as much as we can have a consistent nuclear policy strategy. And that is part of also the credibility of that strategy as well. The other way to kind of solidify these no first use commitments is to either pass a resolution in Congress. There is the No First Use Act from Adam Smith and from Senator Elizabeth Warren. If Congress could pass that and sign it into law, then it becomes a legal restriction. The other way is to have a legally binding treaty for all nuclear weapon states that they all commit to a no first use policy. So there are ways to bring law into it, to really solidify things. And saving that, there are also those force structure and force posture changes to put into place to underscore the no first use policy.
Thanks. Go ahead, Tom.
I just add to that. I agree with everything that Jessica just said. I would say, if you want to look for how we can make no first use more credible, look at China. China has a no first use policy. People question their policy, but I look at their policy and I say, look, they're backing that up by and large, not having their weapons on alert. They don't have their warheads stored on their missiles at any given time. They have a low alert posture. And that's pretty much what we're talking about here. Is you got to have your policy backed up by your posture. And China is doing it as well as you can do, given the situation that they're faced with, right? Now, US policy and other policies may be driving them to change that policy, which would be tragic. But if you look at it right now, China's no first use policy is pretty credible because of the implementation they've done to make it more compelling.
Thank you. Exactly. So to keep on this topic, a couple of related questions. One is, under what circumstances can you imagine an ally asking or permitting or wanting the United States to use nuclear weapons first on their behalf? And I guess related to that is, because the allies are such a big question, what would be your pitch, your best case, your argument, if I sent you, Tom or Jessica, to go reassure them that this policy is in their interest, how would you pitch it? And I'd actually like to hear from both of you if you have thoughts on it.
I'll jump in there. I mean, I think the best way for the Biden administration to pitch this is to say, look, from a U.S. national security perspective, we feel we need to do this. That the United States is going to declare a no first use policy. But you, the allies, we're very concerned about how you feel about this. We want to reassure you. And so let's have a conversation. We want to hear what would reassure you in the context of a no first use policy. And one of the things that we would say is, look, we completely support extended deterrence. We completely support the security of our allies. We have your backs. But extended deterrence is not dependent on no first use. Extended deterrence is not dependent on first use. Extended deterrence is dependent upon reassured or assured retaliation. In other words, if you're attacked with nuclear weapons, we will go after anyone who attacked you with nuclear weapons. That is not a first use promise. And I think our allies would admit that the last thing they would want is the United States to use nuclear weapons on their territory or near their territory in a conflict. The main thing they want is to know that the United States is behind them, and for any adversary of theirs to know that if they get attacked, the United States is going to be there, not with the first use of nuclear weapons, but with the hopefully unnecessary retaliation of nuclear weapons. But again, there's way more that the United States can do to reassure allies than with nuclear weapons. There's conventional weapons, there's deployments, we can send troops, we can give money, we can give assurances. I mean, the US has so many tools in this toolbox to reassure allies that we can't and should not just think about it as nuclear assurances, but much broader assurances against across all military, diplomatic, economic domains. And so the question, so the way I would put it is, we are doing this because we think it serves US national security requirements. We want to help you feel better about it. Let's talk.
Yeah, and I think I would just add to what Tom said about talking with our allies. I think we need to have real conversations about the risks of current US nuclear policy and of posturing and of forward posturing. So what are the risks associated with keeping our nuclear weapons on launch ready alert? Well, the risk is that we stumble into this nuclear war because of a miscalculation or an accident, or we think that somebody is about to attack us with nuclear weapons. Turns out they aren't, but oops, we already started a nuclear war. And I think those risks of kind of looking at ourselves, those risks are very underrepresented, underappreciated in these conversations. And I think the other thing is to have conversations also, and maybe even bring the question that you asked, Laura, the first question that you asked, bring that to our allies and say, okay, where do you see the US using a nuclear weapon first? Where would you want that to happen? And whatever answer that we get, to say, look, we have these conventional options, we have these non-nuclear options that would do much better and not threaten your country or the alliance with a nuclear retaliatory response that would completely devastate the alliance and the economy, all that stuff. So I think having those conversations, okay, it's not just, we would like to do no first use, you tell us no, and then, okay, we won't do it. It's, okay, let's have a conversation to dig into these security concerns and figure them out, because we can have a credible retaliatory response and rely on our non-nuclear capabilities for deterring non-nuclear threats.
Great. Thank you so much. There's a question that connected some of the things you talked about, and it was that at first glance, no first use and having weapons on high alert or at the ready don't seem to be in conflict, and that the US could respond quickly to an attack. Could you elaborate what the arguments are for not having weapons on high alert under a no first use policy? What does having them ready to use mean? I guess both physically, because there are some people on this webinar who are interested in non-experts, and what it means sort of strategically to have them on alert, and maybe also just draw out from your comments what the risks are, because you've alluded to this a couple of times, what the risks of high alert missiles are.
Shall I jump in, Jessica? All right. A great question. To me, the danger of weapons on high alert is the false alarm scenario. That it's frankly the most terrifying scenario for me, which is that there's an alarm, there's a warning of an incoming nuclear attack, and the president would have just 10 minutes to decide what to do. If the weapons are on alert and we have a launch on warning policy, which is that you can launch those weapons under warning of attack, but before the weapons actually get here, then the president feels a lot of pressure to launch at least our ground-based ballistic missiles, our ICBMs, before that potential attack arrives. It's the use them or lose them scenario and danger. So the president is maybe advised by his advisors, look, if you don't launch these things right now, they're going to be destroyed. And the president may not understand that there are submarine weapons out in the oceans that are completely secure. We don't even need the ICBMs. The president may not be in his or her right mind at the time. There's all kinds of reasons why a president might make a bad decision and launch those weapons on warning of an incoming attack. Now, if it turns out that that incoming attack is a false alarm, which is likely, we've had false alarms before. And if you think about it, why would anyone attack the United States knowing that they would be decimated in return, right? The likelihood is that that attack warning is false, not real. But as long as you have weapons on high alert that can be launched within minutes, as long as we have a launch on warning policy that allows us to launch before an attack has been verified, we are open to this risk of starting nuclear war by mistake, which again, to me, is the ultimate nightmare. We don't need to be in this situation. We can take weapons off alert. We can discontinue a launch on warning policy. And the bottom line is that there's no rush. There is simply no rush to respond to a nuclear attack until we know that it's real. Because even if we lose all the ICBMs, which are highly vulnerable, and I think Jessica and I would agree on this, that's the reason why we should get rid of them, because they're highly vulnerable. They're basically an invitation to a first strike. And we don't need them because we have weapons out at sea that are invulnerable to a first strike, in addition to any bombers that manage to get off the ground if there's tactical warning. So having weapons on alert, having a launch on warning policy, highly dangerous, unnecessary, time to get out of it.
And I'd just like to highlight just how fast this decision-making is under launch on warning. So when we receive an indication of a warning, there has to be some analysis done to basically say, okay, what is our confidence in this warning that it's real? If it's high enough confidence, the president gets alerted. They need to secure him. They need to get people on the line to describe what's happening. They need to go through options. All of this is happening in minutes. And the president has about 6 or 7 minutes to ask questions about our options for a response to a potential incoming attack, and make a decision over whether or not to use those nuclear weapons. And so the system is designed for speed, and it is the way it's designed puts pressure on the president to actually use those nuclear weapons. And like Tom said, we are not, the threat of nuclear war is not from a surprise attack. The threat of nuclear war is that a conventional conflict will then escalate to nuclear use. And so there's just no reason to be keeping nuclear weapons on launch ready alert and to have a policy or a practice of launch on warning.
Thank you so much. Again, a reminder to put your questions in the Q&A, although we have many, many excellent questions. I don't think we'll get to all of them. I'll try to bundle them as much together as I can. But I'm seeing a lot of interest in your thoughts about, well, essentially I'd sum it up as the pressure on this process, given the nuclear modernization projects in both Russia and China, and the development of specific technologies such as hypersonic maneuvering missiles, whether that changes some of these assessments, whether this maybe influences a process run out of the Pentagon, how do you address the threat perception? If you could sort of answer how does any of this change? Does any of your policy preferences change? Does the NPR process itself change given these changed threat environments since the last time this process was run?
Well, there's certainly, unfortunately, since the Obama NPR, the threat perceptions have changed in terms of the threats from Russia and China. And I think you're going to see that put a very, very strong imprint on Biden's NPR, that they're going to feel constrained about doing anything bold because of the sense that China and Russia are resurgent, and therefore this is not the time to do anything bold. I think that's exactly the wrong way to think about it. And if you take the example of China, I think part of the reason why China is building up its forces is because they're responding to the United States buildup, to what their concern is that the United States might launch a first strike, in part because we don't have a no first use policy, in part because we have missile defenses that they are concerned either now or in the future could blunt any retaliatory strike that they might have to have to launch. So I think it's actually the other way around, that this perception of resurgence in Russia and China means that we need to do more to reassure China and Russia, that we have no plans to attack them. And in fact, we want to talk with them to try to reassure them, because what we're seeing from Russia and China is in part their concerns about what we're doing, right? And this is a typical problem with a state like the United States, where we think everything we do is benign and that everything our adversaries do is a threat. They, of course, see it the opposite way. So we're all seeing each other from our own viewpoints. We need to realize that even our things that we're doing that we think are defensive to other countries' viewpoints are not necessarily so. And then just a word on hypersonics. I mean, I think the hype around hypersonics is just getting out of control. Hypersonics really don't change anything in my perspective, except that they show the concern of other countries about what we're doing, right? I think the reason why China is testing hypersonics is they're concerned that we may eventually in the future have missile defenses that would be effective against their ICBMs. But we don't now. We simply don't have missile defenses that are effective, reliable against China's current ICBMs. So their hypersonic weapons, to the extent that they develop them, are no additional threat to the United States on top of the ICBMs that they already have. What I see it is that China is feeling the pressure that, what the United States is doing may threaten us in the future. So let's get out there and develop some stuff that might work if US missile defenses ever do work. And by the way, I don't think they ever will in a way that's reliable enough for any president to depend on them. So short answer is a lot is changing in perception, but and I think that ultimately will have a big effect on Biden's NPR, but I don't think it should.
Yeah, again, I agree with Tom. I think that the danger in the hypersonic missiles is that they would cause the US to invest more in missile defense that is not going to work, and that China or Russia or North Korea even is just going to invest more in their capabilities to overcome those missile defenses. And then we are on this cyclical action-reaction arms race. And I agree that the landscape, the political landscape, the media landscape about China especially, it's very difficult to advocate for smarter reactions to this, which includes things like no first use and reducing the role of nuclear weapons in US security, because you say the word reduce and people will say no. China and Russia are building and doing more. We need to build and do more. And that's not the case. We have an arsenal that honestly is even too big for our the threats that we face. We can cut our arsenal by 2/3 and still be able to credibly deter a nuclear attack on the US or our allies. And so there's really kind of a messaging issue that we are up against, but it really takes the president to lead on these issues, to say, look, I believe that we need to reduce the role of nuclear weapons in US security. I believe that will make the US and our allies safer. And you need to give me options in order to do that.
Well, since you both brought it up, could you talk a bit about, at least process-wise and maybe policy-wise, how the Missile Defense Review will interact with the NPR? And how it may affect some of the policy discussions and force structures that might come out of this process. Especially if you know the latest intelligence about how those are working in parallel or all happening all together. I admit to being completely confused myself.
Do you want to start on this one, Jessica?
I was going to say I am actually also confused about the missile defense and when exactly things are related to each other.
Yeah, I don't have any more information on the timing of the Missile Defense Review. I would just say that I would not expect to see anything new or particularly interesting in that process. I mean, look, missile defense is probably the most important issue that no one ever talks about, because it's so central to the problem that we have, which is what freaks Russia and China out is our missile defense program. Even though it's very limited right now, and in my view, very unreliable and ineffective, it's enough to worry China and Russia, not so much about what it can do today, but what it might do down the road. And I'm not talking just about US land-based systems, but also our sea-based systems that I think really freak the Chinese and the Russians out about what their potential is someday. And that's why you see, and they've said this, so I'm not even imagining it, it's actually what they say. This is why you see Russia and China developing these new, what we see as kind of wacky weapon systems that can go around the Earth the other way, and these fractional orbital things and hypersonic weapons and undersea torpedoes. All the one thing that all of these things have in common is that they are meant to evade US missile defenses. Again, even though they're ineffective. And so what we have is ever since the United States withdrew from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty 20 years ago, you have Russia and China, because there's no constraints now on US missile defense deployments. Russia and China have to fear the worst and plan for a possible breakout of US missile defense capabilities. And so we've created a floor below which neither of them will go in their reductions, because they feel they may need to build up to counter our missile defense expansion. So in exchange for missile defenses that don't work, we've essentially made it impossible to get the reductions from Russia and China that would make us safer. So it's a tragic, untenable situation. But frankly, until the Congress and the White House are willing to be honest about the effectiveness of missile defenses, we're just going to be trapped here. And it's a sad tale.
I do maybe hope that there is somewhere to go with missile defense, progress on missile defense in terms of US-Russia strategic stability talks, and hopefully a follow-on to New START, where we're getting down to numbers of nuclear weapons, where we need to be expanding the scope of what these treaties cover to include so-called non-strategic nuclear weapons that are usually more lower yield and are not part of the current New START treaty, but also to include missile defenses. We're at that point where we need to start talking about those types of things that Russia sees, like Tom said, as a threat to their own nuclear systems. So I'm hoping that within those conversations, missile defense will be addressed and maybe even limited, whether it's geographical limitations or limitations on numbers or locations, to make some progress on that in a bilateral or even maybe bilateral with US-China way.
Thanks. To go back to this force structure, I'm just going to stitch back to some of your comments on the lower yield nuclear weapons programs that you mentioned. And to just go back, there are a few questions about essentially what if you could explain what getting rid of the sea-launched cruise missile means, what the import is of having lower yield nuclear weapons. What do you see as the problem, the essential problem there is, and why we would be safer if we didn't have them? If you could just briefly sort of go back over that for the conversation, that would be helpful.
Sure, yeah. So for low yield nuclear weapons, the impetus for those weapons is really, so Russia is believed to have something called escalate to de-escalate, which would mean that they use nuclear weapons early in a conflict in order to show that they are willing to use nuclear weapons, and the other side will back down. It is questionable whether Russia actually has this, but that's the US perception. And so proponents for low yield nuclear weapons basically say we need these weapons in order to have options to respond to use of a low yield nuclear weapon from Russia, because it is not strategic for us to use a higher yield weapon in response to that limited nuclear use. It's really this perception that we can control escalation and kind of control nuclear war. And that's dangerous. A nuclear weapon is a nuclear weapon is a nuclear weapon. You know, we're not going to be saying, well, hold on, what was the yield? How many were what's the damage exactly? Hiroshima and Nagasaki, those weapons are considered low yield weapons. So we're not talking about just these little things that don't do much. If you're crossing the nuclear threshold, no matter what kind of damage it does, you are risking all out nuclear war. And so by having these low yield nuclear weapons, they seem like they're more usable in conflict. And that's the danger in these weapons, is when you have a less, I guess, damage, so to speak, it's easier for a president to say, well, let's use that nuclear weapon and have our own kind of escalate to de-escalate situation. And that's what I'm talking about when I mentioned nuclear war planners going back to planning to fight and win a nuclear war. That's what low yield nuclear weapons are really for. And really what we just need in order to deter nuclear attacks against the US and our allies is we just need a retaliatory force at this point, as we are working with nuclear armed states to eliminate the weapons.
Great, Tom, did you have anything you wanted to add on that? No. Okay, thanks. Yeah, I will note that the most recent Pentagon assessment of the Chinese nuclear forces seem to indicate that China is less convinced that any conflict would remain conventional, and they may be reconsidering their posture as well and seeking lower yield nuclear weapons, which is certainly not the right direction. So to go back a bit to some of the issues that you talked about, there's some questions and they are technical, so, and answer in the ways that you choose, but why do you think eliminating intercontinental ballistic missiles is a more stable solution than reducing submarine launched ballistic missiles? And it seems to be predicated on your assertion, I think Tom, you brought this up, that submarines will be invulnerable indefinitely. And if you could just talk about those two sort of interrelated issues, that would be helpful.
Sure, I'll take a stab at it, and Jessica can jump in. I mean, I think we would both support the elimination of ICBMs because, as we said, they're just highly vulnerable, and so they're kind of an attractive nuisance, you might say. They're sitting in the ground. Everybody knows where they are. Certainly, the Russians and the Chinese know where they are, and so they could be attacked. And their vulnerability creates this use them or lose them situation that we already discussed, that makes them a liability more than an asset. As I like to think about them, you can't use them first because if you use them before an attack arrives, you don't know if the attack is real. You could just be starting nuclear war. So we can't use them first out of the dangers of mistaken nuclear war, but you can't use them second because if you wait till the attack arrives, most of the ICBMs would be destroyed in the ground. So what good are they? Other than kind of and often when the Pentagon talks about the utility of ICBMs, it's as a nuclear sink, which means it would absorb. They've been called a nuclear sponge out in the Midwest, where they're there to absorb a Russian strike. I think that's kind of the definition of insanity, to draw a nuclear attack towards the United States. And I just don't understand why we do that. And the reason why we don't need to do that is because we have our submarines at sea. A significant piece of that force is deployed at sea at any given time. They are deep underwater. They are invulnerable. I think part of what the questioner is getting at is, how do we know they'll be invulnerable forever? And that's an excellent question. And I think we always have to keep on top of that problem by always keeping ahead of the threat, doing our research to understand what the threats are to sub invulnerability, and to make sure that we're staying ahead of that problem by a very healthy, robust R&D program. And I would just add that we are, by developing a new generation of submarines at the hefty cost of over $100 billion, that are going to be quieter and more stealthy. So I think we are staying ahead of that problem. And if it ever fails, then we do have a backup, and that is the bombers, because the bombers can be, launched with tactical warning and get up in the air. And at that point, they're invulnerable, at least for a short period of time, while they still have fuel. And so we do have an insurance policy, and that is the bombers. I don't think the ICBMs are an effective assurance policy, and they're simply too dangerous to have.
If I can, so we are getting close to the end of the time. Thank you so much. And there are too many questions, but I think this is good input for what our next webinars might be. It looks like there's a lot of interest in comments, Jessica, about pit production. But I think that's probably too detailed to get into for the last few minutes. But I did want to ask your opinion, given the coalition and that we're advocates, where you think citizens and scientists can most effectively affect positive change in the NPR policy. Where do you think we would effectively get involved? And we're going to take that to Charlotte right after that, but I'd love to hear from both of you where you think that might, what your answer would be to that.
Jessica, you want to go first on that?
Yeah, I think, first of all, being here is a good first step, and being engaged and interested in these issues. But really, talking to your members of Congress is incredibly important on these issues. We hear from members of Congress a lot that they want to hear from their constituents about how they see these issues. And that really gives the president political capital to work with, to say, look, the public supports it, my constituents support it, therefore I as a Congress member support it. And Biden, you are free to take those steps because you will have the backup of the public and Congress. So that's really where folks can make a difference, and just keeping these issues relevant, and really engaging with other social justice issues, climate change issues, making those connections. These things are all connected, especially when you're talking about the massive amounts that we're spending on our nuclear weapons. And that money can go to real threats like climate change and pandemic preparation. So making those connections with other movements and talking to your members of Congress.
I agree with all that. Just to reemphasize the point that the key decision maker here is the president himself. This is not an open process. It's not, there's no votes involved. It makes it very hard for the public to engage in. But the president is the ultimate decider here. And I agree with Jessica that getting to members of Congress with the request being to write to the president and get him to do the right thing, and to keep your requests very few and simple. And that's why I like no first use as a request, because it's simple, people know what it means, and we know that it's on the top of mind of the people doing the NPR, and that unless they hear pressure from the outside, it's less likely that it will happen.
Well, thank you so much. It has been really wonderful to have you in this discussion. And thank you for being a resource and giving so much time. I'm going to turn it over to Charlotte Selton, our project organizer, and she's going to talk about what activities the coalition is doing around no first use. So thank you.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you so much, Tom and Jessica, for that wonderful, wonderful discussion. So I know that we have a broad audience on this call. Some of you are Physicist Coalition members, some of you are APS members, and some of you may have just found your way here. But whoever you are, I do want to ask you to join us today in taking action to support no first use in the Biden administration's nuclear posture review. So the Physicist Coalition for Nuclear Threat Reduction is an APS-sponsored advocacy group that works to re-engage the physical science community on nuclear weapons policy. And we have been focused on promoting no first use for most of 2021. So in June, the coalition's leadership sent a letter directly to the Biden administration conveying the benefits of a no first use policy. Furthermore, earlier this year, we had a grassroots campaign in support of the Smith-Warren No First Use Act. And I want to thank everybody who joined us in sending hundreds of emails and tweets to elected officials asking for their support and co-sponsorship. We even had 17 coalition members who went a step further and actually met with 15 different key congressional offices to drive this campaign forward even further. However, policy changes like no first use don't happen quickly. That's why we're in this for the long run, and we need a sustained effort. That's why today I want to ask you to do two things. I want you to take action to push no first use forward in the nuclear posture review by writing to your members of Congress. And I want to ask you, if you're not a member already, to join the Physicist Coalition for Nuclear Threat Reduction to be part of a sustained movement towards safer and saner nuclear weapons policy. So I'm going to drop a link in the chat where you can do both of those. To explain our current grassroots advocacy effort, we've seen that the Biden administration is getting pushback against no first use and even sole purpose from moderate members of his own party. So that's why our goal right now is to push for congressional allies and progressives in Congress to champion no first use directly to President Biden. So the Bicameral Nuclear Weapons and Arms Control Working Group, which consists of 35 members of the House and Senate, have been leaders on this issue. So we do want to thank those members of Congress. However, we know that there are more progressives in Congress who could be championing no first use, who are being relatively quiet on it. So that's why if you live in a target member's district or state, we're asking you to send them a letter urging their vocal support on no first use. However, if you live in another district, you can absolutely still help. Rather than writing to your member directly, we're asking you to write then to the House and Senate leaders, Senator Pelosi, Speaker Pelosi, and Senate Majority Leader Schumer in support of no first use, asking them to convey to President Biden that constituents, voters care about this issue and want to see it brought forward in the nuclear posture review. I know that all sounds kind of complicated and you may not know what category you fall into, but that's why we have software that's going to tell you with your address, what district, what state you're in, who you should write to, and what letter we recommend you send. I've already written sample letters and you're welcome to send them as is. I know that not everyone has the time to write a letter from scratch. However, you are welcome to personalize your letter. You can edit it. And in fact, if you have the time and interest, I encourage you to personalize it. Those letters are going to be even more impactful than a form letter because they show Congress that you understand and care deeply about this issue. So I dropped a link in the chat where you can find a letter and where you can join the coalition if you're not already a member. I want to thank you so much for taking action with us. And with our last few minutes, I think I will turn it back to Laura to wrap us up, however she sees fit. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Charlotte. That's a great sum up. And thank you for all your hard work organizing us to be as impactful as possible. We did have a question in the chat asking if moaning that they can't save the chat and the links, but could we, as a follow-up, send the links to these advocacy actions to the people who have signed up for the webinar?
Yeah, so in about a week, we're going to send an email that's going to have a link to a recording of this wonderful webinar. And we'll also include in that email links to sign up for the coalition and to take action and send a letter if you didn't get the chance to do that today.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you to our guests, you were wonderful. And thanks to everybody who spent an hour and a half with us. I really appreciate it. Take care.